Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. One of the scariest things that we could deal with is an EMP or electromagnetic pulse. If we were to experience one, it would have far-reaching and long-term effects on every aspect of our lives. While some people will debate as to whether one's likely or not, I think that they're still worth preparing for, since if you're ready for one of these, you'll be ready for pretty much anything else. So today we're going to cover what would break down after an EMP and what you'll wish that you had to make up for it. And the most obvious breakdown that'll occur after an EMP is that of our energy infrastructure. When an EMP occurs, power lines will act as gigantic antennae that'll channel massive amounts of energy into transformers and other vital pieces of equipment. This will result in widespread overloads and damage, which will take a long time to repair. Larger transformers, like what you'd find at substations, are expensive and they're not made in a whole lot of places, so even when repairs begin, most of us will be pretty far down the waiting list for those pieces of equipment. Because of this, it's a good idea to have alternate ways to generate and store energy and then perform common daily tasks. Having a solar generator protected in some sort of Faraday enclosure would definitely come in handy after an EMP. As long as the sun isn't blocked out due to ash, which is a possibility, you should be able to use the sun to gather and store energy, and it actually isn't too difficult to protect a device like this. You can pick up large Faraday bags to protect generators, or make your own Faraday cage out of a galvanized steel trash can, some metal tape, and aluminum foil. I was able to fit an EcoFlow Delta 2 and one extra battery inside of one of these, along with several other devices I'd like to have if something goes down. Then, while solar panels should be relatively safe from an EMP, I went ahead and packed up a couple of spares in a cardboard box that I wrapped in 5 layers of heavy-duty aluminum foil. During my testing, 3 layers was good enough to block cellular and radio signals, so 5 is a little overkill, but I don't think that that's a bad thing in this case. Now, the downside to protecting devices is that you really need to keep them in there most of the time. We probably wouldn't have a lot of warning before an EMP, so the chances of you being able to scramble and load everything up on a dime is pretty low. The fact that they're easy to get into is one reason why I like the trash can approach and Faraday bags. Another energy-related prep that you'd want to have after an EMP is a way to cook off-grid. Butane stoves are nice since they're fairly safe to use indoors, but they'll be useless after you run out of fuel. So for longer-term situations like an EMP, a rocket stove is also good to have since they rely on natural materials. And aside from a power source, there are some other devices that you'd want to protect as well. Radios are a good option since they'll allow you to communicate with family or group members over short distances, and since they don't require any additional infrastructure, they'll be able to work for as long as you can keep it powered up, and ham radios and GMRS radios can communicate over even longer distances, especially if you manage to protect some repeaters as well. Then, even though you can't transmit with one, it's also worth having an emergency radio stashed away. Radio would likely return a lot faster than other forms of communication since it's a lot more primitive, so this is what state, local, and federal agencies would likely use first in the aftermath of an EMP. Another thing that'd be good to have after a man-made EMP would be a Geiger counter, because while a high-altitude EMP won't cause most people any direct harm, it's very likely that one would immediately precede nuclear ground strikes. Now, obviously, if you're in an area that suffers a direct hit, none of this is going to help you very much. However, if you're outside of a target area, it would definitely be good to know if any radioactive fallout has entered your area, especially when it comes to food and water sources. Then also don't forget to protect some more basic preps like backup lighting and then fans for climate control. I, for example, like to keep at least one headlamp, one flashlight, and an LED lantern in my Faraday cage, along with a small battery-operated fan. And since these rely on batteries, be sure to keep a battery charger in your Faraday cage and have a good supply of rechargeable batteries. Now, when it comes to protecting these kinds of devices, the same rules apply as with solar generators when it comes to storage. To ensure that you have them when you need them, always keep those devices in a Faraday enclosure when they're not in use. I like to keep my older or backup gear in my trash can Faraday cage and keep smaller items I may need to get to quickly, like radios, in a Faraday bag. But even though the energy side of things gets the most attention when it comes to an EMP, Food and water are always going to be some of your most important preps. Grocery stores, just like everything else, will go offline due to a lack of power and the fact that they'll no longer be getting shipments of food. So, having plenty of shelf-stable foods and water stored in your home will be essential, especially in the immediate aftermath of that kind of event. Aside from the fact that people will absolutely ransack anywhere that sells basic essentials, if an EMP is accompanied by ground strikes, it may not be safe to exit your home for at least a couple of weeks. During this time, you'll be completely dependent on what you have in your home. For water, simple things like portable water storage containers could help you stay alive for at least a few weeks, while larger things like 55-gallon drums can be kept in your garage. Also, don't overlook last-ditch water storage options like aquapods or water bob emergency bathtub bladders, and even 5-gallon buckets. You can use food-grade ones for backup drinking water and non-food-grade ones for cleaning tasks. In most places, water delivery systems rely on gravity to deliver treated water from water towers to homes, so there will probably be a short window of time where you can collect that water before it's depleted. When it comes to food, focus on things that are easy to prepare and safe to eat without cooking, and canned goods are some of the best things for this. Canned fruits will taste fine just straight out of the can, and even most things that a lot of us would prefer to cook, like soups, chili, and meats, are still perfectly safe to eat without cooking. Freeze-dried meals would also be good to have if you need a shelter in place, since most of them are also safe to eat without being reheated because they were cooked beforehand. Just be sure to store additional water for these kinds of meals and anything else that requires water to prepare, like dry rice, beans, and pasta. Then, if there were ground strikes, only consider things like rainwater harvesting after radiation levels have decreased significantly. Also, be sure to have a way to treat any water that you collect and use a Geiger counter to make sure it isn't radioactive. For long-term situations where you would need to rely on gardening, remove at least the first 5 to 6 inches of topsoil to reduce the chances of your crops being contaminated. And if you plan on gardening, having a good supply of heirloom seeds would be very useful. Just be sure to practice gardening ahead of time because there is a significant learning curve to it. Another huge thing that'll break down after an EMP is transportation. Even if your car manages to survive, the infrastructure that keeps it running will be totally non-existent. Refineries will shut down along with factories that produce things like batteries and tires, and so will modern shipping logistics. The shipping systems that move things like oil across the country rely on complex computer systems, and without them, all of that will stop working. So that means that cargo ships, trains, and even trucks will stop running, even if they themselves survive an EMP, which might not be the case. Then, even if fuel manages to make it to your town, gas pumps won't be operational because they contain grid-connected computer systems that would get fried. And since all modern cars make heavy use of computers and electronics, there's a chance that they won't work either. So, if we were to experience an EMP, you would need to find new ways to get yourself and supplies from point A to point B. Bicycles are an excellent option because of their efficiency and the fact that you can equip them with saddlebags and even hook them up to a trailer. And then they're also a whole lot faster than walking as well. But even with one, there's still a good chance you'll be doing a lot more walking than you are now, so be sure to have some good shoes and boots set aside, along with plenty of socks. And since an EMP will likely fry a lot of our technology, we'll also need to rely more on old school navigation tools like maps. I like to have paper road maps for my region and then topographical maps for my local area. These can be used to navigate and also find resources like water. Then, of course, you'll also want to have a good compass as well. Since your car or truck may not be working, you also need alternative ways to move supplies, and heavy-duty wagons and carts would definitely be useful for this. They can be used to move water from nearby local sources back to your home, or maybe building supplies or gardening supplies around your property. Then there's also no telling where you'll be when an EMP happens, and because of this, everyone should have a well-equipped get-home bag and additional supplies for their vehicle. My EDC bag is always with me when I go to work, and it has everything I need to gather and treat water, along with some food and basic survival supplies. Then, if my truck isn't working, I could still grab some supplies out of it, put them in my EDC or get-home bag, and then head home. If you're a commuter who doesn't have their own vehicle, then it'd be a good idea to have at least some survival supplies hidden at your office. Another important thing that'll break down after an EMP is our medical infrastructure. Since the grid will be down, hospitals and other medical facilities will have to rely on generator power. But even that would depend on whether or not the generators are still operational, because they would probably get fried as well. Then very little, if any, medical equipment is hardened against an EMP or protected in Faraday enclosures. So this means that medical personnel will be forced to rely on more primitive forms of medicine, greatly limiting what they're able to treat. Then, since transportation will be affected, deliveries of medications and other supplies will halt. So, because of this, you need to be prepared to deal with as many of your family's medical needs as possible. Even basic things like bandages and antiseptics could be game changers, since even small wounds can become infected and cause really big problems. And if you're able to take care of these and keep them clean, you could avoid a lot of issues down the road. And since you'll probably be doing more physical activity, splints and braces would also be good to have. Then, as far as medications are concerned, basic things like pain relievers and fever reducers, stomach medications, and decongestants are always useful. If you have small children, also be sure to pick up medications for them, since they may need different formulations of those. Now, if you're on prescriptions, that would obviously be a pretty big challenge, because a lot of doctors are hesitant to prescribe more medications than what you would normally need. However, there are services out there that can help you with this, at least to an extent. While they mainly started out providing emergency antibiotics, some companies like Jace Medical can now prescribe emergency supplies of chronic medications, like those that are used to treat things like heart disease and diabetes. But even if you have a good stockpile of medications and other supplies, they won't be worth much if you don't know how to use them. So, if you have the opportunity to get some basic first aid training, then definitely jump on that. Also, be sure to have good reference materials like the Survival Medicine Handbook to help you out if you're in a situation where finding an actual doctor would be totally impossible. Another really important thing that you'll need to consider after an EMP is defense. Because if one were to occur, emergency services, including the police, would be stretched well beyond their limits, and as things continue to deteriorate, many of those folks may start to focus more on their own family's survival, which is understandable. So there's a really good chance that when things really start to fall apart, you and your loved ones will be on your own. And when it comes to defense, nearly everyone talks about guns and ammo, which would obviously be very, very important, but there's also other things to consider as well. For example, you probably won't be the only one shooting, so body armor would be a good thing to have. Soft body armor, like this t-shirt with level 3A ballistic panels or inserts designed for backpacks, are good for everyday use. However, if we were in a long-term disaster, having plate armor that can stop rifle rounds would definitely be preferable. Then don't overlook ways to harden your home's physical security. A door reinforcement kit like this one will make it much harder to kick your door in. It's basically an extended strike plate that comes with long screws that'll sink all the way down into your door frame studs. These can be installed today, and most people won't even notice that they're there. But if things get more serious, like what you'd experience after an EMP, then barricade brackets can be installed on either side of your door, which will allow you to use a 2x4 to further reinforce it. And window film can be used to make it much harder for somebody to smash your windows or throw things through them. Another thing that you'd want to have is blackout curtains. These can help reduce the amount of light that's visible from the outside of your home, and this would be really important after an EMP. You may not want people knowing that you're there at all, and you definitely don't want to be the only person around that has lights on. If a desperate person sees that, they may assume that you have other useful things as well, and then you would have some pretty big problems. So, always take light discipline and sound discipline very seriously. If blackout curtains don't do the job, then you could use cardboard boxes or moving blankets to fully eliminate any light exiting your home. Then aside from the devices I mentioned earlier, there are some small pieces of defensive tech that you may want to protect from an EMP. Magnetic door and window alarms will help you know if someone has entered your home, while battery-operated driveway alarms are useful for monitoring the outside of your home and also larger pieces of property. They use radio signals, so they should work after an EMP as long as you can prevent them from getting fried in the first place and you can keep them powered up. And if you have any battery operated optics like red dots that you don't use too often, those would be good to protect as well. And if you use a quick detach mount, it'll make the process of removing and replacing those a whole lot easier. Now, like I said earlier, food and water storage will be some of the most important things after an EMP. So if you want to see a list of foods that every prepper should stockpile, then click here. Or if you want to see how to purify water during a long-term disaster, then click here. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.